China versus America. The war has already begun, and apparently my team didn't get the memo, because right now, China is winning. This ain't no clickbait, yo. Just 3 days ago, Congress held a very important hearing that barely anyone even reported on. And while it covered a variety of different issues, there was only one that was on everybody's minds. China! America is in a lot of trouble. And as it turns out, the CCP has already begun to occupy American soil. Now, most of you guys who have subscribed to this channel, by the way, if you haven't already, do it right now. Do it. Already know that I like to 说得很夸张and 说大鸡大条. But bruh, this time it's for real. And by the time you get to the end of this video, you will very clearly understand exactly why Trump wants to declare a state of emergency as soon as he steps in the White House. And possibly, maybe, you couldn't even declare war. So get your popcorn, your poke, your gummy bears, and several bottles of whiskey ready. Because by the time you reach the end of this video, you'll be shouting it at your screen. 大鸡大条. So a few days ago, Trump replied to a social media post with one word that instantly set the internet on fire.
This morning, President-elect Trump signaling a major move on immigration, responding true to a post on his social media platform, saying he will declare a national emergency and use military assets for a mass deportation program, a program he pledged to implement during his campaign, which focused in part on immigration and the southern border.
And with this, netizens fell into a panic as the news reported that sources close to Trump say his #1 deportation target ain't Mexicans, but military-aged Chinese males. Now, unfortunately, no one knows the exact source, as it's anonymous, so it could be BS. But if you look at Trump's previous statements from just a half year ago, you'll find out it just might be true.
What is disconcerting, we have 31,000 people over the last few months. They're coming in from China, 32,000 over the last few months, and they're all military age, and they mostly are men. And it sounds like to me, are they trying to build a little army in our country? Is that what they're trying to do? And Biden doesn't know because the guy doesn't have a clue. This is country changing, this is country threatening, and it's country wrecking. They're destroying our country, they're wrecking our country. As a citizen, I demand that Joe Biden close the border immediately.
Now, it ain't no secret that Trump does not like China, specifically the CCP. And if you want to get a clearer picture of exactly how Trump will deal with China once he gets back in, then look no further than one person, Ronald Reagan. Trump practically modeled his policies and his campaign after this guy. And these two actually have quite a bit in common. They're both Republicans, they're both TV stars, they're both nearly the exact same height.
Well, aren't you going to ask me in?
I was just going to bed.
Ron said his client had a rich uncle, but Donald Trump.
I like keeping a low profile.
Now, whereas Reagan has played multiple characters on TV, Trump has pretty much always played himself. But there's also one shocking similarity between the two. They've both been shot and walked away from it.
Ronald Reagan was 2 months into his presidency when John Hinckley Jr. drew a $29 handgun outside the Washington Hilton Hotel on March 30th, 1981.
They see something that said, take a look at what happened.
Also, fun fact, Reagan and Trump are the only two presidents in American history to have been divorced. And they also both like telling jokes. Real talk, Reagan is pretty much Trump the old xiang.
Well, to me, there's no contest. I mean, I think Ronald Reagan was one of the great presidents, period, not just recently. I thought he had the demeanor. I thought he had the bearing. I thought he had the thought process. We had respect. We were respected as a nation. And that's one of the reasons I really loved Ronald Reagan as president.
I mean, this guy even copied Reagan's campaign slogan, to the letter.
Ronald Reagan for president. Let's make America great again.
So as you can see, Reagan had a pretty big influence on Trump, and Reagan's legacy on America was also pretty big. From deregulation to small government to tax cuts, and even his America First agenda. These were all the components of what we now call Reaganism. And it seems like Trump is trying to shape his next term exactly in Reagan's image. And there's also one very important characteristic that these two have exactly in common. They both hate communism.
She said, I have a question. She said, was communism invented by a politician or a scientist? Well, he said, a politician. She said, that explains it. A scientist would have tried it on mice first.
Now, he is laughing and joking here, but trust me, when it came down to business, Reagan was the most hardcore anti-communist president in American history.
And suddenly, though, I heard him saying, I love my little girls more than anything, and I said to myself, oh no, don't say that. But I had underestimated him. He went on, "I would rather see my little girls die now, still believing in God, than have them grow up under communism and one day die no longer believing in God."
This is the dude who brought down the largest and most powerful communist country at the time. Back then, we viewed the Soviet Union the exact same way we are viewing China right now. Extremely powerful, slowly but surely beginning to take over America and willing to replace it at a moment's notice. Now, many of Reagan's policies were directly responsible for the Soviet Union's collapse. And we already know what Trump tried to do before and what he's going to try and do again whenever he gets back in against China. But where Trump and Reagan are very different is that Trump's communist enemy has already set foot on American soil and is already occupying American land. These aren't just immigrants, yo. These are straight up hardened PLA soldiers. For the CCP to pull this off, it wasn't even difficult, barely even an inconvenience.
Easy peasy lemon squeezy.
In the next chapter, you'll see exactly how America fell right into its trap, sparking a war that began without launching a single missile or even firing a single shot. Right now, the land of the free is losing badly. So a few days ago, the US Senate held a hearing to further discuss aliens, yell at FEMA for fucking up the immigration issue, and most importantly, discuss the greatest threat to American democracy, the CCP.
In the case of many of these Chinese adversaries, espionage would be the number one objective or motive in order to collect information. But as I mentioned with Vanguard Panda, and this has been covered pretty extensively elsewhere, there is a concern about pre-positioning. So if there was to be, for example, an escalation around Taiwan, could they use that access to disrupt logistics or disrupt military operations or critical infrastructure in the region that would potentially slow or disrupt the U.S. response?
This is Adam Myers, the senior VP of an award-winning cybersecurity company whose clients include Vegas casinos, Amazon, and most importantly, NVIDIA. Now, Adam is only one of several people on a panel of cybersecurity experts testifying at this hearing, and these guys are some of the best in the game. So, brace yourself for what you're about to hear next.
Does the use of foreign network hardware in this country, like for instance Huawei, does that make these vulnerabilities worse? Is that something we should be particularly concerned about? What's the effect of that? How does that play into this?
Well, I think with a lot of that foreign technology, there's really no way to assess what's in there. In other words, there is a hardware supply chain concern there. They could have other microchips or other software running inside those devices, so this should be a huge concern.
Is that true of American companies whose hardware is manufactured in China?
Potentially, that could be part of the supply chain concern if it comes back with something different than what was spec'd, yes.
Now, they mentioned a very notable CCP hacker group known as Vanguard Panda. And these fools specialize in launching cyber attacks via Chinese-made hardware and software. And guess who is their largest importer?
Mr. President, let me just ask you on that point, and I've seen your report here, which ties will bind, which is extremely alarming in many respects. And I want to make sure I get some of these figures right. You say, based on your research, 80% of Apple's suppliers are based in China.
So that's almost exactly right. 80% of Apple's suppliers have at least one facility in China. That's not to say that all of them, that 80% are in China.
I got it. 95% of Apple's key consumer products are manufactured in China.
That's according to Financial Times story. That number is coming down right now, but when the report was written, those were the figures.
32% of Amazon's suppliers are based in China. These are huge numbers. I guess my question is, and you said in your testimony a moment ago, you don't advocate total or full decoupling. I'm just wondering, with numbers like these, are these companies able to decouple at all? I mean, this is an incredible dependency that you outline in your report.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think right now, part of my answer against decoupling is based on the fact that there is no way to completely decouple right now. If you sever manufacturing ties to China, the electronics industry ceases to function essentially. So I advocate for a de-risking approach where these companies have to set up alternative supply chains in other countries, whether that's in Southeast Asia, South Asia, closer to the United States. It's going to take some time to build up these alternative supply chains.
Fun fact, 61% of Americans use iPhones, and a small share of those components in the iPhones are made in China. No big risk, right?
Wrong.
Yeah, America's largest server company has 85% of their components being made in China. And by the end of next year, they will barely even be able to get it down to 50%. What's even worse is that even if America wanted to completely ban Chinese-made electronics, they couldn't, because that would mean the complete collapse of the American electronics industry. In other words, the CCP owns American electronics.
So to you, much of the equipment used in the administration of U.S. critical infrastructure, particularly telecommunication, is or was manufactured in China. What are the national security implications of Chinese technology and equipment in our networks?
Thanks for the question, Senator. The implications are significant from a variety of perspectives. Probably the lowest hanging fruit is we still have a lot of Chinese Huawei and ZTE equipment in small service providers in rural America. There was a rip and replace bill that was put in place in 2020, partially funded, funded to the tune of about 40%, $1.9 billion. But there's another $3.3 billion needed to pull out that Huawei gear from these service providers, typically small, more than 6,000 sites across America. And oh, by the way, many of them are very close to military installations. Senator Daines has put forth a bill to address that in this Congress. So that's about the lowest hanging fruit we have. But without knowing what's in the products, whether they be products that have an American name on them or a trusted country's name on them or a Chinese company's name on them, we don't really know what's in there. And that's why we started Supply Chain Security SCS 9001. It requires a full bill of materials. It requires understanding from a zero trust perspective where all the software comes from. Synopsys earlier this year did a study of looking at 1,000 code bases of various enterprise equipment and found that 96% used open source software and more than 70% had critical vulnerabilities. So this is pervasive. It's a massive issue.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know, an ISP is a company who provides internet service. In America, one of the largest ones is Comcast, and in Taiwan, we have Zhonghua Dianxin. And in this context, nodes are pretty much routers, which is where all information passes through. Like I mentioned before, the majority of routers are made in China. That means Xi Jinping knows exactly which SOD star you're spanking it to. So if a war breaks out, he can shut that shit down, leaving you holding your dick.
Fuck.
In other words, the CCP owns American internet.
They are always looking for a more efficient way to spy on us. Now, one of the things we realized they had started to use is routers and the embedding of malware into these routers. And of course, the U.S. had hackers used routers to target some of our critical infrastructure and water systems. And Director Wray brought this up in one of our hearings, that what they were doing was pre-positioning themselves to carry out a larger attack. So we know this is here. So Senator Lujan and I introduced the Routers Act, which would give us an ability to guard against these cyber threats. And it's a pretty simple bill, because it requires Commerce to review the national security threat that comes from some of these routers and technologies that are developed, manufactured, or supplied coming out of China.
Now, hackers can also use compromised routers to attack America's important infrastructures, such as water systems. In other words, the commies own America's water supply.
Let's talk a little bit about Tesla. Half of its production, a third of its sales, roughly, are dependent on China. Does that concern you, Mr. Stonefish, Mr. Bresnik, and why?
It absolutely does concern me, and it's a very, very difficult position for Mr. Musk to be in that Beijing loves to use corporate leverage over U.S. companies and U.S. individuals to advance its national security interests. And frankly, I don't know how Mr. Musk can balance the interests he has with the U.S. government, with Tesla, and with SpaceX at the same time. It's very, very challenging. This spring, Mr. Musk was in Beijing meeting with the Chinese premier, Li Qiang. He wrote an article, he was the first foreigner to do so, writing an article for a big Chinese propaganda outlet a couple years ago. And it's amazing he's managed this balancing act for so long, and I'm very curious to see how he keeps it up.
Jesus, even America's Iron Man has been compromised by the Mandarin. So now the commies own the U.S. electric car industry.
We're in the IoT phase where everything is connected in our homes, whether it's your doorbell or a video camera or your refrigerator. Each of these devices is an avenue of access. And typically, we as consumers buy the least expensive thing that's out there, which is the least secure thing that's out there. So it is getting to be a bigger problem than before.
And the commies also own your refrigerator, your nanny cam, and even your goddamn doorbell, yo.
So as far as has Chinese exploitation and espionage gotten worse, I'd say that there's three things I would comment on there. Yes, it absolutely has increased. The first concern is that it's matured. They've moved away from smash and grab operations to bulk collection, longer term operations against upstream providers, whether it be telecoms, ISPs, consulting organizations, professional services. So they've matured how they do it and what they're collecting. The second thing, in 2017, 2018, Chinese national security law has effectively privatized the vulnerability research or crowdsourced it, meaning if you do vulnerability research in China, it doesn't go to the vendor as it would here in the United States in order to ensure that it gets fixed and that there's no exploitation. It goes through the Chinese government. So they effectively get first right of refusal for any weapons that are created by researchers or by research organizations and things like the Tianfu Cup, where they have phone-to-own competitions to see who can write these vulnerabilities. And it's become more opaque, so we only see what maybe categories have won, but we don't actually see what the vulnerabilities or the exploits are.
So, the CCP invasion has already begun, and it is organized as fuck. With a large-scale surveillance operation, and these fools are even hosting hacking competitions to see who can come up with the most damaging Trojans and exploits.
We've seen that the Chinese have diversified who's doing these operations. Prior to 2015, this was largely the People's Liberation Army. Following the reorg of the People's Liberation Army in 2015, 2016, we started seeing the Ministry of State Security taking a greater role, and now a whole bunch of contract elements, which we've seen in the news and U.S. indictments. U.S. Department of Justice has identified many of them. They are expanding it. So they've effectively created a offensive cyber operations industrial base within China, which is building weapons and capabilities and tools at an incredible pace.
The key phrase being offensive cyber operations. And with Trump already planning to add cartels to the terrorist watch list, who do you think will be the next one he adds on? Now, some of you might be thinking,那只是电子网络的风险而已啊，洗金铺要偷看我的 SOD 没关系啦，我其实已经有女朋友，所以我比较少看呢。Word? Well, the next time you take your girlfriend out to dinner or take her out to a movie, it just might be your last. Because the poo now owns two of America's largest and most important resources, the land and the food.
Today, I focus of this committee is the danger that China poses to American agriculture. Over the years, I have witnessed this hostile communist country work to systematically take over our food supply chain. They have decades ago started buying our fertilizer companies, controlling our ability to access fertilizer, bring it into the United States. Then I watched them buy up our chemical companies as I worked on implementation of programs and policies at our state level and at the federal level. I watched us as we sold citizenship to Chinese communist members of the Communist Party for investment into our processing systems, and now most of our processing facilities are owned by the Communist Party or Chinese government. Now they are coming for our land. And when they buy up our land, they will complete their chain of control of our food supply. Between 2010 and 2020, the Chinese Communist Party's holdings of ag land increased by 5,300%. Reports now show that China owns about 384,000 acres of U.S. ag land, valued at over $2 billion. This should be alarming to all of us. USDA admits that this may not even account for all of the land that they own because there's very little track of foreign interests that are involved in these large transactions. In fact, there's very little reporting that happens at the state or the federal level, and little consequences for allowing countries who hate us from owning our land.
Kristi Noem, the two-term governor of South Dakota, who Trump has recently tapped as his Secretary of Homeland Security. And just like Ronald Reagan and Trump, she hates the CCP in her bones.
Just this past summer, we had members of the Communist Party contact our state government and want to come and visit, tour our processing facilities, see our farms, and visit South Dakota. We declined all of those meetings, but just within days we received a phone call from the State Department telling us that those were Chinese spies. They were there to steal our intellectual property, to steal our genetics, and wanted to debrief us if we had met with them. Thank God we did not. We were told they were there to help improve our trade relations, that they were there to improve our business and our exports, and instead they were there to steal from the United States of America. So the threat is very real to us every single day, what China is doing, and they have a 1,000-year plan to become the world dominating power in the world, and the only thing standing in their way is America. Just this past summer, it was very clear to me when those Chinese spies were in our state that China wants to control us, and they want to do that by controlling our food supply. The Chinese Communist Party is not our friend, they're not our partner, and they're not our ally, they're our enemy. And they're a rapidly expanding national security threat that can't be ignored.
So the CCP is a goddamn enemy. This is the mindset of the next Secretary of Homeland Security. And it also seems to be the consensus of Trump's entire cabinet.
Communist China is using every tool at its disposal to conduct a coordinated campaign to surveil and collect information on Americans. One of the ways that the CCP is doing this is through infiltrating our telecommunications and technology markets. Despite this clear and present threat posed by Communist Chinese-controlled telecommunications company, many still maintain authorities to operate in the United States. Even worse, while some CCP-controlled companies like Huawei and ZTE have been publicly identified, there are other communist Chinese telecom and tech companies that have not yet drawn public scrutiny. My Bipartisan FACT Act will provide much-needed transparency into the level of Communist China's infiltration into our technology sector. The FACT Act will require the Federal Communications Commission to publish a list of companies who both hold FCC authorizations and have any ownership by foreign adversarial governments, including China, Russia, Iran, and others. This public disclosure will help to shine a light on the malign access and influence Communist Chinese companies have inside our tech and telecom markets. We cannot allow companies controlled by the CCP or other foreign adversaries to have unfettered and unknown access to our telecommunications infrastructure.
Elise Stefanik, the woman tapped to be Trump's U.S. ambassador to the UN, and along with Russia and Iran, she sees China as an enemy of the state.
China's building an army specifically dedicated to defeating the United States of America. That is their strategic outset. Take hypersonic missiles. So if our whole power projection platform is aircraft carriers and the ability to project power that way strategically around the globe, and yeah, we have a nuclear triad and all of that, but a big part of it. And if 15 hypersonic missiles can take out our 10 aircraft carriers in the first 20 minutes of a conflict, what does that look like? By the way, China probably has more people here, as many or more than these terrorist organizations, and they have a grand plan and a grand strategy to, they believe the whole 20th century was anti-Chinese. The whole architecture, the whole security architecture from NATO to the World Bank to everything exists to serve America's interests, which in some parts they did exist to serve the interests of the winner. All those institutions, of course, have been totally corrupted and all of that. But originally, they were meant to create a strategic architecture that reinforced the dominance of the West. So they reject all of those things. And they are seeking to, the only way they can implement a structure that serves them is by defeating us. And they know that. And they're ambitious enough, the leaders, Xi Jinping and others in the CCP, to put in a plan to do it. And we're too busy. And then we... not only do we not do anything about it, but we let in TikTok where they can trans our kids and they don't trans their kids.
Pete Hegseth, Trump's pick for Secretary of Defense, and he understands all too clearly that China is planning to replace America. In fact, they're already attempting to do so right now.
Yeah, first of all, I would say that there's a fact, every major anti-China proposal that has been voted on in the last 5 years have been my bill. So much so that China has actually sanctioned and banned me. And I was very upset about that because I had to cancel my vacation in Wuhan. So, but all kidding aside, the 21st century will be defined by the relationship between the United States and China. We wasted 20 years thinking that once China got rich and prosperous, they would become like us. And we woke up into a world where they don't want to become like us. They want to replace us. We made one mistake. Number one, we allowed American manufacturing to leave this country and go to China. And so today, they own the manufacturing capacity. 88% of pharmaceuticals come from there. So that's why I've worked on things like bringing the pharmaceutical industry back to the United States, particularly in Puerto Rico, and I have a bill that will do that. The second thing is we have to begin to invest in our military, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, to defeat the weapon systems they're innovating. We don't need the Pentagon spending all its time producing videos on the proper use of pronouns. We need them focused on how to blow up aircraft carriers made by China.
And then there's China's biggest critic of all, Senator Marco Rubio. And to everyone's surprise, Trump chose him as his Secretary of State. And it ain't no secret that these two used to hate each other. So it is clear that in order for him to overlook his differences with Marco, Trump has one very clear criteria that you must meet. You have to hate the CCP in your bones. And now it's official. The Warhawks have entered the chat.
Assemble.
So, from CCP operatives running the cartel on the border, to PLA soldiers already on standby on American soil, to the CCP owning America's electronics, vehicles, land, and food. These infectious motherfuckers are everywhere. 所以如果你不觉得我说的太夸张 say it with me now. 代志大条. So, will the orange man be able to successfully expel the red men? Is deportation and declaring a state of emergency enough? Because something tells me we're about to enter a brand new age of terrorism very soon. Economic terrorism, market terrorism, and maybe even agri-terrorism. One thing's for sure, even if we manage to keep Putin from pressing that red button over the next 2 months, the next 4 years in America is going to be an absolute battle royale. Or I could be wrong. Let me know what you think down below. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you on the flip side. Peace!